Great. Julia Lefkowitz, thank you so much for joining us and for your wonderful lecture. It was really fantastic and really caps off what's been sort of three, I think, really nice lectures on newspapers and sort of quantitative study of newspapers. So I hope all the students have enjoyed that. And this is a chance for us to just ask you a few more questions. So I wanted to start off with this question, which sort of really got my attention in listening to your lecture, which is, you show that there's this increase in the comparative prevalence of positive journalistic values over time. That's sort of clear from your data. But I wonder what this says about sort of the absolute state of journalism in the UK, by which I mean sort of, it's clear things are getting better, but they might still not be very good, right? And I think there's some people who would argue, they're still not very good. That's something you hear a lot from people, especially with the UK, that the media is in this bad state or whatever. But at the same time, there might be reason for more optimism even than that in your data. So I wondered if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yep, that's a great question. So I guess that kind of taps into the notion of like, were newspapers ever really that great to begin with? Like, what was the original state of journalism in the UK, during the first year of the study? We'll use that as a benchmark since that's the context we're working with. And having looked at a large number of articles from The Guardian and The Mirror in particular from those years, The Guardian being the one that would be more, the literature would indicate would be more kind of in line with information orientation and quality journalism. The level was very impressive from back then. You get a lot of very in-depth, context-heavy pieces about hard news topics. So I feel very confident saying that the level was quite high for quality news publications back then, and the fact that it has become even more information oriented is a very strong finding. In terms of tabloids, I mean, I think that there appeared to be quite a bit more continuity. I mean, popular culture, which is often kind of a headline grabber for tabloids, the dynamics might have been a bit different back then, but it actually, I don't know, it appears rather similar to what we see today. But of course, we also have the study found an increase in information orientation. So again, I think it points to, that we can feel good about the direction that journalism has been going in the past couple of years since the mainstream ascension of the internet, that it wasn't going from a really catastrophic state to something slightly better, that it was pretty solid and on comparable terms to what we have now, even in 1968.
That's really interesting. And I think it really speaks to sort of what's so cool about the data that you've provided, and also, your ability to actually go in and read some of these articles and sort of make that sort of expert judgment as to the quality of some of these earlier articles, I think is really cool, and also speaks to the archival work that you've done in actually putting together and finding some of these sort of front pages from newspapers in the 1960s, which I imagine, can't have been easy in some cases.
It was, yes. Getting a hold of some of the articles involved, visiting some libraries, which was fun. There was definitely some legwork involved, but I should also add based on your last point that, actually looking at the articles, the kind of qualitative component of a quantitative study, if you can, kind of have a look at some of the pieces, some of the individual texts, that can really give some really informative context. I had originally wanted to do kind of a critical discourse analysis to a couple of articles in my study, but the quantitative element kind of became so vast and there were such kind of substantial findings that I stuck with that. But I do think that there is a lot of value added if you can add a qualitative component, whether that be just yourself kind of reading a bunch of the articles and actually getting a sense for the entirety of a few of the pieces of the overall picture, or if you want to apply and you know have the resources to apply like a smaller discourse analysis as well, that can be really a powerful way of triangulating your work and your findings.
Very cool. Very cool.
No, this is really fun, Julia, and I think you know it's picking up not just on your work, it's picking up not just on some of the themes of the course in terms of just practically like newspapers are this kind of wonderful way to look into the sort of mass cultural mind, but also these really simple methods, right, that are helping you track things. So I guess my question is, I'm going to show my hand, right? So you know, one of the ideas in our course is that these quantitative methods are sort of picking up on these surface features that we hope are then cluing us into something more substantive, right? And so, you know, in your case, you have this kind of thick notion of sensationalism and, you know, like sensationalism. Well, I'm not quite sure how one might define that, but, you know, there's emotionality and event orientation, and I'm not quite sure. So I'm wondering about the ways in which, you know, the surface signals can get out of sync with the underlying things you want to track. And so one thing I've noticed just in recent years is the New York Times, so that would be like our guardian. The New York Times started using the word lies recently, like maybe in the last 5-10 years. You know, they should have been using it in 2003 when talking about the Iraq War. They didn't quite. But now it's like, you know, Trump's lies, or, you know, senator refuses to condemn vaccine lies. So that word is, I would say, very emotive word. It still strikes me as emotive. In that case, however, if when we're using that word to track, there would be some kind of weird, you know, you would be kind of shifting away from the underlying thing, because one might think, oh, actually, this is not indicating a shift away from information content, just, you know, let's say a stylistic shift. The other example I have in mind is some work done on the, I mean, it's so obvious, the word gay. So this is a word that's kind of shifting, where early on, you know, okay, in 1960, well, I don't know, 1940, the word gay is doing something. In 1990, it's something very different. So I'm wondering, how did you think about that? I mean, this is always a problem, but how did you think about the kind of the way these two levels could get out of sync with each other?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess as you're saying, it's impossible to kind of separate the text from the context. So where possible, I try to like kind of identify and limit the independent variables, and where I did think there might be kind of like cultural shifts that might have had an impact on trends in language and content. I tried to be explicit about that. I would say the best thing you could do is just to kind of like think through, I mean, so say if you were looking to track those two words, I mean, that could be a study in and of itself that would be so rich. So if you were tracking kind of like other kind of words that might have changed in meaning over time, you would certainly have a number of independent variables. I would say just try to like limit the scope of your study so that there aren't like kind of too many different cases like that where you have like words that might really have changed in meaning. So I was looking at different kind of types of speech in my study, different parts of speech. So for example, like first and second person pronouns. And I did expect to see an increase in those, especially because kind of media linguistics and linguistics literature has talked about kind of an increasing familiarization of discourse more broadly, especially with the ascension of information communication technologies, the idea that like language has become increasingly kind of familiar and informal. So, you know, saying like you and I, that was something that I expected to see more of. So that was like a finding. When those parts of speech did actually increase, I was able to kind of connect it to that contextual kind of tidbit that I knew and tried to be prepared for going into the study. But yeah, again, I would just say try to be aware of like as many kind of like independent variables or cultural stemming variables as possible.
Yeah, I take it in that answer, Julia, you're kind of saying, rather, Simon's identifying kind of problems with the semantics of a particular word, right?
Yeah.
But in some sense, what you're doing in your study is looking at like grammatical features of the language under study, and that that might enable you to have a little bit more stability over time, in the sense that the grammar of a language maybe is a little less fickle than its semantics in at least some cases.
Yes, that would be an interesting point to research, like how stable is grammar versus like the etymology of specific words or semantics, like you said. It probably did grant me a bit more stability. I think that's a good point.
Thanks. I wanted to sorry, go ahead, Simon. Go ahead.
No, I just think, I'm thinking about like the NPR shows, which have a very high level of informality and, second person singular direction, but are also, we probably classify them as high content. And I guess it's, these cases of, where the style is or is not connecting to the substance. And I think that's sort of this open question that always comes up in these studies.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But sorry, go on. I interrupted.
No, yeah. I actually kind of wanted to piggyback a little more on what you were saying, Simon, and just put it to Julia that you identify in your presentation, I think, these really three interesting kind of axes for thinking about journalistic values: sensationalism, personalization, and information orientation. I just wanted to invite you really to kind of say a little bit more about how you understand these three things conceptually and how they got measured in the context of your study.
That's a good question. I hope you don't mind. Like I took some notes about those definitions because it was very important to go into the study with pretty precise definitions for each. So you have a precise definition that's precisely kind of operationalized. If you can, always kind of defer back to that to kind of like reinforce your findings, then you're good to go. So if it's all right, I can just read some of the definitions for the three different values, and I can also mention the parts of speech that I use to operationalize each. So the first was sensationalism can be understood as the journalistic deployment of content and language that stands to provoke sensory and emotional reactions from readers as a result of emphasis placed on drama, magnitude, salaciousness, and or the unexpected. And I used, for that value, I had actually the most proxies, since there are a number of different types of adjectives and adverbs. So the broadest were general adjectives and adverbs. And then I did different kinds of superlatives and degree adverbs. I did superlative degree adverbs and superlative general adverbs. And then the sixth one were amplifiers. And I did quite a bit of pilot work, because there are actually even more, there might be some linguistics pros that are listening to this, but there are many more like types of adjectives and adverbs out there. So through pilot work, I identified the ones that were the most salient and that I really didn't think made sense to part with for the study. And I kept those six in. And then for personalization, so this can be defined as journalistic focus on an individual or entity representative of a larger theme or topic, whereby emphasis on the personal and or emotional often supersedes the emphasis on fact or public affairs oriented information. So it's personalization, not in the sense of something customized, but in the sense of like focusing on like a person or a theme, kind of, rather than the broader situation, story, theme at large. And it was a bit easier kind of to choose the proxies for this. I went in kind of knowing that first and second person pronouns would definitely be indices of interest. There's a bit of media linguistics research that has followed these specific parts of speech and journalism over time. And these studies tended to kind of end before the mainstream ascension of the internet. So I thought, it seems like an obvious thing to see, how have these parts of speech become much more salient with the internet's mainstream ascension. Like if there's been this informalization of language with the expansion of ICTs and stemming from the mainstream ascension of the internet, we would expect to see that. So that is what the data did show. And then the third part of speech that I chose were private verbs, which can be contrasted with public verbs. So public verbs are verbs such as state, declare. It's like the act of putting something out there, positing it, whereas private verbs, it's kind of like an internal state, so something you think, believe, so it's something that's directly kind of connected to the personal. And it was interesting, actually, those did not increase over time, while first and second person pronouns like really shot up over time. And I think that could be connected to a substantial increase in quoted speech. Now it's much easier for a journalist to get quotes from people, whether it be through an email, Twitter, phone call. So there are much more quotes from ordinary people today than there were, 40 years ago. And ordinary people are tend to be associated with more informal language. Whereas if you're kind of interviewing like a government official, they're going to speak in a more kind of formal, manner. And that's something that I'd love to investigate in another study. There's some research that has looked at change in direct discourse or quoted speech in journalism over time, but I think there's like a lot more that can be done here. I think that it's probably changed in really nuanced and intricate ways with the ascension of the internet. And then finally, the last one, information orientation. It's a term which captures the quantitatively operationalizable components of the multiple values depicted as traditionally characteristic of quality British newspapers. So this was one I kind of had to come up with more on my own for the sake of having a value that was indexical of quality journalism and which could also be operationalized. So say, for example, objectivity, which also is not as salient in British quality journalism as it is in American quality journalism. It's very difficult to operationalize quantitatively. It's something that you would have to kind of go at the qualitative level and look for attributes like how is agency distributed, etc. So instead, I kind of termed something called information orientation, which with proxies that I thought could, based on the literature as well, on media linguistics literature, be said to be indexical of kind of more context heavy information oriented discourse. And for information orientation, I used article length. So the idea that like a longer article has more information in it. Sentence length, average word length, and then the final one was the Flesch-Kincaid readability metric, which is basically a metric that can be calculated, which identifies the reading level of any text. So it's to see if the reading level was initially kind of at an 8th grade reading level, has it gone up to like 10th grade reading level, or has it declined? So it's kind of it's a scale, it's a numeric scale, and which can be interpreted. So those indices were kind of meant to operationalize the level and the informational quality of the text. And again, it involved a bit of pilot work to see what the findings would look like, based on intuition. In some literature, I thought that these indices would be feasible, but it's always good for this kind of work, I think, to do some pilot work, because you never know until you try your original corpus and you know the measures that you want to try. It's better just to do it in a pilot study than to apply it to the whole study and then kind of be like, I'm not sure if something funny happened here. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does, and I think it's just so great. I just want to highlight, it's such a comprehensive answer, and I think it's really good for our students, who, we next week's lecture is going to be on measurement. We've been talking about operationalization pretty much every lecture, and I think there's only so much we can do within the confines of one lecture to really, we can kind of gesture at, look, you have to do a lot of conceptual work to sort of set up your operationalization, how that's going to look quantitatively. And I think what you just went through in terms of these three very specific, sort of very considered definitions and how those led naturally into sort of particular linguistic things that you were going to look for, informed by like media linguistics, humanities, research scholarship. I think it's exactly the kind of thing that we're sort of preaching in this course. So thank you for such a, sort of comprehensive run through of how you did that.
Thank you.
So this is great. So since we're hoping to speak to our students today, I have my sort of other question I have for you is the kind of response you got from people who don't do this in the humanities, and this, I'll speak from my own personal experience. The old silverbacks in the room, right? So when you were doing this stuff, I'm sure you had a lot of support from people. But I'm also curious, what were the negative responses that you were getting, and then obviously, how did you sort of devastatingly crush these negative responses? But more seriously, I'm sort of curious about the kinds of objections that you ran into, not let's say technical, but more let's say in the culture of the field, in the culture of media studies, in history of newspapers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I started my thesis, I was in the English department, and I had one advisor who had kind of a pretty strictly qualitative background, and another one who did more quantitative work. And my advisor that was qualitatively oriented did not take, I felt like, I really needed to know my audience. And that's the point, is like, know who's going to be evaluating you, because I did end up switching departments, and that was actually a kind of a part of it, was that, some people do firmly believe that, that you have to have qualitative work, that it has these really strong virtues. And I agree that qualitative work is really great. But in this particular case, I really felt like there was a strong need to do a quantitative study, because there just wasn't the type of quantitative data in the field that I thought was kind of important. And then once I switched departments, I had a different audience, and it was very kind of well received. And there was like a great interest in working with, these numerical results, and, can we create new kind of like metrics to do a composite tabloidization measure and a composite quantitative measure. So I think my time between the two departments really taught me to know who my audience was in advance. Like, if you're going to be evaluated by someone who is really deep in the school of qualitative work, I'd be aware of that. But hopefully you can find people that really appreciate the virtues of quantitative work, and I think and then you'll kind of find the support you need. I don't mean to be negative. I know your audience is just kind of the most important thing I can say.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how does one know one's audience? Like,
that's a good point. I mean, I guess, if you're who is going, presumably, your audience here is working on a thesis. Like, who do you think might evaluate your thesis? Is someone that you are really interested in working with, do they normally do quantitative work? Are they open to quantitative work? You could touch base with them and share with them, like, your plans, the quantitative method you're thinking of applying. People tend to be willing to answer these types of questions and talk about, talk about their viewpoints. Yep, I would just be, reach out to a potential evaluator or someone that you want to work with, and really just be direct. And there's no, I mean, it's, you have a great plan, and you just want to make sure that you're kind of on the same page in terms of like these more subjective kind of matters like qualitative, quantitative. Just make sure you're on the same page with someone who you might be working with or someone who might be assessing you.
All right.
Yeah, I think in this course we sort of really emphasize the virtue of quantitative research from a traditional humanities perspective. But I think it's important to remember that there comes a point at which you can't convince everyone that doesn't want to be convinced. And so I think as scholars there comes a moment of strategy where you do sort of have to move on to the people that can be convinced. So I think on that note, we'll thank Julia for really fantastic presentation and fantastic Q&A. And yeah, just let you go and just say thank you again for such wonderful presentation. I believe your contact information was in your slides, so if students want to reach out to you who might be interested in doing more than this kind of work, I'm sure you would welcome that.
I would definitely welcome it. Please feel free to get in touch. And thank you, Simon and David. It was a really enjoyable Q&A. Thank you.